Hi, welcome back. This is Andrew Sears again, and in week 5, we're going to talk about organizational risk profiles, a tool called the Competing Values Framework, and faith-based organization nonprofit board governance, and this also applies to general nonprofits. So I've worked. We ran a internship program, and we placed over 500 interns and over 100 Christian ministries, faith-based nonprofit organizations, and I saw the intimate details of these organizations because we worked with them. And I saw, over a 10-year period or maybe 15-year period, which ones thrived, which ones closed, and had crises, and what those reasons were. Plus, I've ran my own nonprofit for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of the risk that's out there. So this is the order that I would put the risk to faith-based nonprofits. So this probably is pretty accurate for small to mid-size faith-based nonprofits. If you're a very large, your risk profile might be a little different, but you probably have the same items on here. The number one reason I've seen organizations close is from limited financial resources. So what I'm going to do is each of these explain the risk and then what the board's role. So the board can help with fundraising, and the board also can set goals for the executive director, fundraising goals for the executive director. In many cases, I will get people who work under me to do things that they wouldn't do unless they were required to do it, and sometimes the board has to do that with the executive director. Probably the second most significant thing that I've seen, especially because I work with a lot of ministries that serve the poor, is burnout or loss of key leader without a successor. In the board speak, they call this succession planning, but honestly, I think that the bigger issue is how do you not burn people out? And ultimately a big part of that's executive director support, and it ties back in with resources. These things all relate. The third thing is a moral failure, or sometimes relational failure of a senior leader. So this could be the person becomes addicted, the person has a sexual scandal, the person just has some sort of meltdown. And that ultimately, what you can do is have executive director support and have accountability. The fourth thing that I've seen is the most common destructive item is a ministry or church split or mutiny, where you have half the organization spin off or a third of the organization spin off. And ultimately what you need to do there is support organizational health. I cover a lot of the issues with this in my cross-cultural management course. The fifth is fraud or gross financial mismanagement. So, often you'll have good-hearted people in faith-based organizations, but they're doing faith-based budgeting, and they might just not even know how much money's there, and they're spending a lot of money that doesn't exist. So ultimately, the board needs to provide financial or fiscal oversight. An issue that's become much more significant, it's been in the news a lot, is sexual abuse or misconduct. So you have to have policies to protect clients and staff. Seventh one is secularization and mission drift. Ultimately, the biggest thing there is around hiring policies and board selection. 8 is a government investigation. So ultimately, that's fiscal oversight and policies. Lawsuits, that's risk management policies. Another one, slow death from irrelevance. I put that 10 because most small and medium-sized nonprofits may not be an issue. For nonprofits that have been around for 50 or 100 years, that might be a bigger concern than running out of money. And ultimately, the board needs to be involved in change management. Being cross-culturally effective. Again, this might be more significant for some of the larger nonprofits, but having diversity policies. In some cases, I view organizations that don't care about how well they reflect those they serve. It's almost like a performance-enhancing drug. In the short term, it makes the organization look better because you can, in many ways, if everyone in the organization is the same, you're going to perform better in the short term. In the long term, though, generally you're not, and especially if those you're serving are different. than you. So based on that, what does that mean in terms of, so, if those are the top 11 risk, I would have liked to have gotten it down to 10. What's the implications of this typology that I talked about last week? So as I mentioned, there's faith-filled, faith-based, and faith-linked. And depending on what category you're in, you have different risk profiles. So I already covered these top 5 items last week, so I'm not going to go into them, but just as kind of a reminder, faith-linked are those that are, more historically faith-based. Faith-based will take government funding, but generally has very strong requirements to maintain the organization mission. And faith-filled generally won't take any government funding, and they don't have to separate out faith in any of their programs. So for each of these, what are the different risks? So there's the risk of secularization. If you're faith-filled, that's very small. Faith-based, it's moderate. Faith-linked is either high or you're already secularized. The next risk is what I would call the risk of legal ostracism. I lived in Boston. I now live outside of San Diego. And if you're in the Northeast and West or any sort of space it's very far on the left, then you're going to have higher risk of legal ostracism. If you live in a place like India or in a Muslim country, then a Christian faith-filled organization that's serving the poor, especially in Muslim countries, you might be killed if that was your model. There's different models depending on the environment. If you are in the Midwest and South, then your risk of legal ostracism is smaller. And what do I mean by this? So InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, they only hire Christians, and they have been banned from college campuses and many college campuses on the Northeast and West. There's been some significant court cases where they've won those, but it creates a big problem during that 10-year period while the Supreme Court's considering your case. Then faith-based organizations, have less of a risk, and then if you're faith-linked, you don't have as much risk. Now, as I mentioned before, the risk of cross-cultural ineffectiveness or cultural irrelevance, it's often high, especially if the organization is dominated by male, white, evangelical leadership. Faith-centered often is moderate, and I are faith-based. So I ran a evangelical Christian nonprofit organization that received government funding, and among AmeriCorps grantees, we had the highest percentage of Black and Latino AmeriCorps members, and we had 2/3 of our folks were either Black or Latino. 2/3 of our sites where we place interns were Black and Latino led. We had the highest percentage out of anyone in AmeriCorps. We couldn't have done that without government funding, to be honest. And the loss of government funding has affected our diversity. But having said that, it's allowed us to focus more on our core values. So then faith-linked and faith-based, this is, I would say, a moderate issue. So having a risk of a government investigation. So if you're not taking any government money, then you're probably not going to be investigated. Now, you may be banned in some ways, but you probably won't be investigated because they generally investigate if you're taking government money. Faith-based organizations, in many ways, I've been considering whether those faith-based organizations that receive grants, I think it's highly likely in the next 10 or 20 years that that's going to be almost like this Gaza Strip domain where you live halfway in between these two groups, and that land is basically not going to exist except being highly legally contentious. Now, having said that, in the U.S., there's a significant difference for things like vouchers or Pell Grant or things along those lines where right now there's no contention on that. Now, in 20 or 40 years, there might be, but there's very little risk of government investigation related to faith. Now, there could be related to other items, and we've seen that. And then there's also a risk of just becoming too legalistic. So, faith-based in many ways can be a little more moderate. There's a risk on the faith-filled side to become legalism on the conservative side. On the faith-linked side, to be honest, and I went to school at MIT, they had extreme liberal legalism. So depending on what your typology, what type of organization you are, you might have different risk profiles. So the idea is how your board is going to manage is going to have to consider what is your risk profile. So another way of looking at risk profile. So if that's one grid that you can consider risk profiles, you can look at, if you're a faith-based organization, where do you fall on the Wesleyan quadrilateral? If you are emphasize scripture, then the higher risk might be legalism. If you emphasize tradition, then the higher risk might be cultural irrelevance. If you emphasize experience, then you might experience more unhealthy chaos. And if you emphasize reason, then you might have the risk of secularization, or what I would called before liberal legalism. So the idea is, if you're off in one of in various directions, so the idea is that you want to try to minimize your risk and to have your board manage these things, so that they're considering all elements of your risk. Your board needs to consider, are you becoming legalistic, or are you becoming culturally irrelevant? So one of the best tools to do that is something called competing values leadership, and analyzing organizations. For many of you are familiar with personality tests like Myers-Briggs. This is almost the organizational equivalent of the Myers-Briggs test. And one of the things we're going to have you do this week is you're going to take what's called the OCAI inventory. There's a free version of it, and it will give a profile of your organization. So this test has 4 dimensions, and from top to bottom, it's flexible and focused. So if you're familiar with Myers-Briggs, if you're not familiar with Myers-Briggs, I apologize, but I'm going to use some analogies with Myers-Briggs. So Myers-Briggs P is analogous to flexible. So if you don't know what P means, basically it just means flexible. Myers-Briggs J is focused or structured. So that's top to bottom, and then left to right is internal in the organization and external. So depending on where you are as an organization, if you're focused on the internal and you're flexible, that's going to be the clan. So at the top, and this is how it relates to the previous session, experience and reason generally dominates at the top in terms of how truth, and scripture and tradition dominate at the bottom. Now, there's the idea behind competing values leadership is that most of the tensions happen on the diagonals. So it's hard to be very creative and very controlling at the same time, as an example. And it's hard to do things first and do things right. So it creates a tension between there. And the example I use, startup values. So if you're doing a startup organization like a .com or some sort of entrepreneurial startup, then you might have, create a lot of different things, do breakthroughs, trying to do things first. Whereas if you're focused on governance, you're going to be focused more on control, doing the right things. It's going to be incremental. If you're familiar with innovation, the top right is more like disruptive innovation. The bottom left is incremental innovation. And then the other diagonal is the diagonal between long-term, and they call this clan, but I call it ministry values, or it could almost be family values. So, and that, in Myers-Briggs is the feeling, the perceiving values versus the business values, the competing. So this is one of the biggest tensions that ministries face. Do you just try to get things done, or do you just care for your people? And ultimately, what the OCAI can do is it will create a profile. And this profile is actually City Vision's profile that I developed whenever I took this for City Vision. And City Vision's very strong in the adhocracy. I'm an innovator, MIT graduate, did .coms. We're also very, very strong on ministry values. We came out of CCDA and are very strong in those values. But the challenge that we've had is we're not as strong on the market values. We're the most of our degrees are most affordable school out there, and then on the hierarchy, we need to add structure. So the idea behind this competing values profile, the OCAI profile, is that organizations go through a life cycle. And you start as an early stage startup, and you're going to be very focused on the creative and maybe, a little bit of a clan, a little bit of market, but almost no rules. So this is, early days of Facebook or something, right? And then you get to the mid stage, you're going to add a little bit more rules. And then you get to a late stage organization. So this is the organizations that's all about the rules. It's risking dying. In many cases, though, this could be effective if you're in manufacturing and you're in an industry that doesn't change that much. But eventually, though, you have to reinvent your organization. So this is what happened with Microsoft. So Microsoft started off early stage startup, came mid stage, was starting to die, and then reinvent itself. Same thing happened with Apple. So Steve Jobs came, they kicked Steve Jobs out because ultimately they needed some of this hierarchical value, some of the organization. And then whenever he came back, he reinvented the organization. So what's the role of boards? Ultimately, the role of boards is in the governance function. So they are going to pull the organization in this direction. So they're going to try to provide a control function. But the idea isn't that the board just pulls the organization in this direction. What the board needs to do is the board needs to look at the entire profile of the organization and try to keep the organization balanced and healthy given its mission. So one other way of looking at this is, this is from a cross-cultural course. So often in cross-cultural ministry, we're called to be bridge builders. So we have our clients that are kind of across this bridge, and we're trying to get to them, and then we have to connect with resources. So if your organization is too focused on flexibility, you might be close to your clients, especially if you're serving the poor. But you are likely going to be creating too much risk in many domains. And I have lived that out for, 10, 15 years where, coming out of CCDA, that's a big part of the Christian Community Development Association is being as close as possible to the clients. But ultimately, it just creates a lot of risk that can create dysfunction. Now, on the other side, if you're too close to the resources, then that is going to create unbalanced stability, and then that's going to limit your cross-cultural and effectiveness. So what do you need to do? You need to find some sort of balance. So how does this competing values leadership and the OCAI relate to risk? So in the book, Competing Values Leadership, there's a chart that talks about what are the big issues of risk. And it says, if you get too far over here under the control, then you become stifling bureaucracy, and you might have a slow death of cultural irrelevance. You might have micromanagement, too rigid, overregulated, iron-bound tradition. So that can create challenges, right? If you get too unbalanced under compete, you become an oppressive sweatshop, and your risk is going to be burnout from drivenness, and you overexert, your tyrannical goal focus, you have unproductive conflict and blind ambition, right? And then if you create too much, think of all these, tech startups. You describe what it's like to work there, and it's this tumultuous anarchy. But also in a lot of ministries that are like this, and I've been around a lot of charismatic ministries, and they have this thing called program of the week. We're going to change a program every week. You have ungrounded vision. the founder of Tesla, he comes up with all these crazy ideas, and a lot of people give him credit for his crazy ideas, but the reality is that outside of Tesla, a lot of his crazy ideas haven't been doing as well. And there's a lot of visionaries that can't actually realize their vision. And ultimately, the risk here, if you don't want to have any sort of policies, then you're going to have issues of fraud, financial mismanagement, sexual abuse and misconduct, lawsuits, and government investigations. And then over here, the irresponsible country club also could be, I could put in that category the church that's just about its own members. But it also could be a ministry that's, very focused. A lot of CCDA ministries are like, we got to keep it real by being close to the poor. The challenge is that you're experiencing a lot of lack of funding, you're experiencing burnout from lack of resources, and then you have just a lot of dysfunction that happens out of that. So ultimately what you need to do is, if your profile is like City Vision's, and let me go back real quick to City Vision's profile, we got to move the organization down. We're doing a lot of efforts to increase some of our functions here. We're doing a lot of here in the hierarchy domain, and a lot of the functions in the market domain is ultimately what we have to do to be more functional. So if your organization has problems in one of these domains, ultimately what you need to do is if you need more control, you need to start to implement a lot of the things and the actions that are going to policies, do a lot more on board development and things along those lines. If it's compete, at the end of the day, one of the big things you need to do, if you're keeping it real, and there's a point in our organizational history where over half my board members were in poverty. I was keeping it real, but the problem was I didn't, I was on the collaborating on the clan, but I wasn't able to compete. We didn't have access to funds. So, we have to bring in some people who have the business values. So ultimately what the recommendation out of all this is what's the point? So you develop an organizational risk profile, and that's one of the things we're going to have you do in this week's assignment, is to just say, okay, here's what the biggest risks are for my organization. And then what's the board's strategic response? What can it do? So you can use tools like the Competing Values Framework, the OCAI, faith-based typology, the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, to say, okay, here's the most common risk, and to identify risk based on known details of your organization, and to identify specific board strategic response. Now, I think it's important, there's certain organizations that they're always afraid of something, and it's this boogeyman, right? So, and I'll use, I've seen two big boogeymen in ministry. And one is the CCDA boogeyman, where it's like, you're not keeping it real if, every person on your board isn't in poverty or something along those lines, right? That's an exaggeration, but that's a challenge. The other boogeyman that I've seen that everyone acts like they're afraid of is the secularization boogeyman. Secularization may be the biggest risk you're facing for a lot of organizations, and I don't want to over the long term, for a lot of organizations over the 50, 100-year period, that actually probably is the number one risk for an organization over 100 years. If you last 100 years, that's probably your biggest risk over a 100-year period. But in many cases, the biggest issue may be becoming culturally irrelevant. I lived in South Africa, and I saw what happened whenever South Africa changed from being a white dominant society to a black dominant society. In that country, it was much more dramatic, but overnight, all the white ministries shut down immediately within a couple year period. And ultimately, that's going to happen not in the U.S., not in a couple year period, but it's going to happen in a 20 to 40 year period, unless there's a lot more balance. So the point of this is, be honest about your risk. Don't just, say there's a boogeyman out there, but try to really assess what your risk is.